Welcome everyone. We're excited to have all of you here to join us today to launch our new workshop series, Accessibility in STEM, or AIS in short, which is organized by the Accessibility Subcommittee at Genetic Society of America. First, let me briefly introduce our subcommittee and today's inaugural event. The Accessibility Subcommittee at GSA aims to raise the awareness of challenges and needs of early career scientists and students with disabilities, and will work to promote accessibility within the Early Career Leadership Program at GSA. Today, we're kickstarting our new workshop series with panelists Ingrid Steiner, Logan Gin, and Sheryl Burgstahler, who will be talking about inclusive teaching practices and ways to promote accessibility in STEM education. My name is Peiwei Chen, your host for today. I'll be moderating today's panel discussion along with Angela, who is the co-host. Next slide, please. As shown on the slide here are our subcommittee members. Today's workshop was developed by Seljan and me, but every other member has contributed to planning and launching this new workshop series. I also want to give a special shout out to GSA staff, Jessica, Berlin, Vincent, and Matthew for providing guidance and technical support. Lastly, I want to share a few notes and rules of the event today. Any opinions or views shared here are those solely of the panelists themselves. And we welcome you to ask questions by entering into the chat, and we will have a live Q&A session towards the end. Any inappropriate or disrespectful behavior is not welcome these days and might lead to removal from the meeting. Today's meeting is also being recorded, and we will post the recording at GSA's YouTube channel after the event. With that, let's begin today's discussion by introducing our panelists. Please briefly introduce yourself by telling us what you do and how you got to your current position. Let's start with Ingrid.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I'm in Los Angeles, so it's morning time for me yet. I'm the Associate Director of Faculty Development at USC, the University of Southern California. And the way I kind of came into accessibility and this interest in this field is, and we can talk about it later, I know that's one of the questions, but certainly thinking about who has access to education. And I do a lot of research in academic ableism, as well as a focus on faculty development and faculty possible resistances, as well as adoption.
Logan?
Well, hello, everyone. I'm also very happy to be here. My name is Logan Gin. I am currently Assistant Director for STEM Education at Brown University's Center for Teaching and Learning. And my background and the way I come at this is from biology education PhD program that I recently completed at Arizona State University. And so I've thought a lot about the ways in which students with disabilities navigate different STEM learning environments. And my dissertation work focused on students with disabilities in active learning courses, in online courses, and then more authentic research experiences as well. And I'm excited to join the conversation.
Thank you, Logan. Sheryl, please.
Sheryl Burgstahler at the University of Washington here in Seattle, and I direct accessible technology services. My background is in STEM and math and computer science specifically, and I've taught middle school, high school, college, and university courses in those fields. So I come from academically, but personally I had experience in my early 20s when ultimately my husband died of cancer. Hodgkin's lymphoma, but because of the treatment he received, which was quite experimental at the time, he received high doses of radiation that paralyzed him because too much penetrated his spine. And so we also were introduced to accessibility issues. We were actually students here at the University of Washington and hadn't paid much attention to the accessibility issues until then. And so that was before the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so there weren't a lot of accessibility features as well. So I just, after he died, it just made me very interested in accessibility, and by background being in computer science, I naturally gravitated to accessibility of IT, particularly when the microcomputer came out with the first PCs and Apple II. So I've been fooling around with accessible technology and accessible technology design since then.
Awesome, thank you. I think we all agree that accessibility in education is very important. So could you all briefly comment on why do you think we should all try to promote accessibility in education? we all have our own life experiences, but for those who may or may not have the same experience, why do you think we should all incorporate accessibility as we design teaching?
I'll start with that because it's the right thing to do. And it's what we say we do. We are always at our post-secondary campuses and elsewhere talking about being inclusive. And I don't think anyone would boldly say, well, there are some students in my class I do not want to have full access to what I'm teaching. I don't think anybody would say that. And so it's usually people that just haven't thought about it very much. And so it's the right thing to do. But also there are some legal issues as well. And there are laws and post-secondary education, for instance, the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act did not specifically talk about accessibility of IT, for instance, my field, but they do talk about civil rights. And so people with disabilities just simply have a right to be part of whatever we're doing. And so we should make efforts to make things accessible to them. And there are a lot of legal issues over the years, particularly in the accessibility of IT, hundreds of them a year on the inaccessibility of IT. And I don't like to look first to legislation. I look first to the right thing to do, but it has kind of generated some additional interest in this area, as it often does.
I think to comment on Cheryl's point there, I certainly come at it from the moral, the right thing to do as well, but also knowing that there are legal mandates for access as well is incredibly important. In that so there's kind of two ways to the same conversation. And the other thing that I also like to think about is disability. Becoming a forefront of a conversation of diversity as well. And we often, in some spaces, we often think about other identities, but often forget about disability and disability kind of as a culture and a community of individuals with disabilities can be incredibly important to the scientific community, for example, right? And kind of including folks with disabilities in those discussions.
And I'll add one bit to that, Logan, is that one thing that's frustrating me too, even if people who don't think of disability as being a diversity issue in and of itself, which we both agree it is, but even when they're working with other students, like they're working with female students or Black students or whatever, often they do not include people with disabilities within their group. And so there's a lot of discrimination against people with disabilities within other marginalized groups and people with disabilities who are part of those groups and have a legitimate reason to be included in those efforts.
I think from an academic ableism standpoint, we always think about the kind of the academy and academia as this place that it's for the cognitively and physically superior. And there's a book written about this by Jay Dolmage is kind of the seminal work in this field. But thinking about, does that create a barrier to access for students, for some students, whatever their intersectionality identities might be? But thinking about how can we really walk the walk, as Sheryl said, and Logan, in terms of, yes, we want to be an inclusive environment, but are we really being inclusive? So really thinking about how we can interrogate those systems and policies and approaches that we have both inside the classroom and on a more university-wide level.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think all of us here probably will agree that accessibility in education is very important. So what do you think are some of the examples, practically speaking, that actually incorporate accessibility in the teaching? Like, what are some of the teaching practices that you think highlight accessibility as the core?
I'll start. I think one of the things is being proactive and really thinking through what you're doing within the classroom as the professor. So you will probably have the ability to design the teaching practices as well as the assessments and the environment that you're going to be in. And when you have an assignment, really going through that assignment and saying, is this accessible to all students? So if you're asking somebody to do something under the hood, do they have access to that? Can they, if they are using a wheelchair for mobility? And I also want to point out too, you might have students that it might be a permanent disability or it might be a temporary disability. So you might have a student in week 3 that suddenly needs a wheelchair for mobility. So are you providing that same educational experience for that student with your assignments and assessments and teaching practices?
I can jump in with a little IT stuff here, as I often do. But two of the most common accommodations for students with disabilities during the pandemic here, when we're all online, so we've got to test our systems really closely, are the accessible design of documents and content, otherwise content, like PDFs and Word documents, even in the content pages, which are in HTML, not being accessible. And the second one is accessibility of videos. And that is primarily for people who are deaf, but also it benefits people who are English language learners. We only have to look at YouTube a little bit to realize that few people that post their videos I think realize they can go in and edit those captions that the computer has generated. But most, from my experiences, most faculty members do not. And so imagine an introductory video in a course and the captions are without punctuation and words are misspelled. That's a very uninviting, unwelcome message to send to our students who are deaf and students who are English language learners and others as well who benefit from captions. But there's some fairly simple things that individuals can do to make their documents and their videos more accessible.
And I'll just jump in to add to both Ingrid and Cheryl's points there in terms of thinking about a lot of this proactively and from a design standpoint, and almost on the assumption that students with disabilities are going to be in your classroom spaces and that students might request accommodations and kind of proactively thinking about maybe some of the barriers that students may face to again kind of design your course or what you're doing in a way that that is already accounting for maybe some of those challenges. That way we don't necessarily get into a retroactive system where there's delays in students receiving the content that they need or the accommodations that they need, et cetera. And then one kind of small thing that I often like to think about in terms of assessing students is trying to think about lower stakes assessments as a kind of concrete strategy to mitigate some of the challenges that all students may have, but in particular those who may receive accommodations, as opposed to having just a midterm and a final exam as a way to evaluate students, thinking about other means to be able to assess students in kind of in a more equitable fashion that allows kind of for some of that more formative assessment can be really helpful for thinking about accessibility.
Yeah, and Logan, that really ties in with what we were talking about earlier about why are you doing this? One of it is to just be inclusive. And if we really think that we're being inclusive of people with disabilities, why don't we prepare ahead of time for them? Why don't we assume that some of them are going to be in our class? And adding to that importance too is most students with disabilities do not register with the Disability Services Office. Why? Well, it's not me to answer. It's a very personal decision, frankly. But a lot of students with disabilities tell me they're a little worried about faculty members not treating them fairly or thinking they're not full participants or whatever, thinking, well, I can get by without it. And actually, some students with disabilities don't need accommodations for a particular class, particularly if it's accessibly designed. That's often called universal design practices, the proactive design of the content of your classes, and encouraging faculty members to do that and support services to also help make that happen is really important. That whole idea of being proactive, being prepared. We do it for other students. We think about students that are going to be in our class. I think all of us that teach, but sometimes faculty think more about the average student or the typical student, and they really kind of design for that person. First of all, I don't think they'll find an average student, but even if they did, why not think more diversely, thinking about the range of characteristics students might have that could have to do with race or ethnicity or age or whatever, gender, but also ability level, and just be prepared for them.
And just to add on to that, Sheryl, is the other thing in terms of thinking about who our students are, some of the disabilities may be invisible, right? And, you look out into your classroom and think about disability and you might have a, kind of a narrow view of what disability is. But in fact, we have some data that suggests that a lot the primary types of disabilities served by a disability resource center, again thinking about documentation and access, et cetera, but are primarily learning disabilities and mental health related challenges as well. So if we think about just physical disability, for example, we're essentially, not necessarily thinking about all the types of disabilities that our students may have. So just something to also think about, the visible and the invisible.
Absolutely. I think we're beginning to touch on this topic a little bit, like both Sheryl and Logan. So if someone is starting out, be a grad student, postdoc, or just a new professor, they are starting to begin to design their class. So for someone new like that, what would you recommend as a good starting point to, incorporate accessibility in their teaching? Or what are some of the resources they can look up to design their course?
I think there's a lot of information out there available to you, surprisingly, and obviously there's not a huge adoption of all that information that's available, unfortunately. But one of the best places if you're a faculty member is to start on your campus. And ask what support services you have there. So whether that be student-facing disability services office, and they go by various names, or if they have, like we have a split dual roles here, and we at USC, we have the Office of Student Accommodations, and then we also have the Office of Institutional Accessibility. So both of those provide different services to different audiences. So ask what's available, whether that's a workshop, whether it's resources that are posted that you can go through at your leisure asynchronously. And also then do a simple Google search and find things like Sheryl's group, the Do It, is a fantastic resource. I know many other universities have a lot of information about how to make your documents accessible and accessible teaching practices in various disciplines as well, that is public on their website. So those are some places I would start.
Yeah, adding on to that, that's a good list of things. Figure out what you have on campus, and even things that aren't specific for students with disabilities, like learning centers and tutoring centers and so forth, would be good to know. But also you could talk with your disabled student services counselors. One of them is ask, what kind of accommodations do you provide for students with disabilities? And then reflect on each one. Could I have done something in my class so that accommodation would not be necessary? Like I edited my captions on my videos, or I learned how to create accessible Word documents or PDFs or whatever. Have I learned to do that? And then there's some real basic, simple things you can do, which we have a lot in our Center on Universal Design and Education, that really don't take a lot of understanding, and they just make your course better for everyone. Picking up on something Logan said a little while ago is giving your students multiple ways to learn things, but also to demonstrate what they've learned. Some low stakes things like grading your discussion posts as well as some big project, and having some, maybe in the middle of that, some short assignments and so forth. And then giving students different ways to communicate with you in an online course, offering them communicate via email or Zoom or Skype or something for one-on-one meetings, giving that agency to the student whenever you can, and let them choose. I like to communicate on Zoom, but it's not about me when people are meeting one-on-one with me. It's the students' opportunity. And then things like minimizing the number of attached documents. When you think about, some classes will have just a whole bunch of attached documents. So the instructor will say, well, I'm going to create some instruction here in Word, and then they can just attach to it. Well, that involves all these extra steps for downloading and stuff for every student. And so that can be really confusing to some students with disabilities, and it can be not very accessible to some students as well. And so thinking about, can I copy, and maybe I'll develop that content in Word, but maybe I could copy and paste it and put it in the content management page, which is HTML, the design characteristics of a website, and then use the structure within there, heading 1 and heading 2 and heading 3, and doing some simple things like including alternative text for images that students who are blind that have screen readers can actually read that to them, so they don't miss out on anything. And then thinking about your assignments. I have an assignment in the class I'm teaching right now where they have to go out and look on the internet for a certain image, and then post a discussion on the discussion board what they learned from that image. I have more specifics than that, but anyway, but I also say, alternatively, you can describe a physical environment that had these characteristics, because I'm anticipating proactively, like we've been saying over and over. I'm thinking, who would not be able to do that first assignment as I described it? Well, someone who can't see the image. What will they do? Well, they'll probably ask somebody, a sighted person or whatever, but what can I do so they don't have to have that accommodation? And all I have to do is say, here's an alternative. You can just describe a physical environment you were in rather than provide a picture. I also tell the students that have a picture, by the way, that they have to describe it in text for the person who might be blind, who is responding to their messages.
Wonderful. So are there any requests that you encounter? They are not so common, you know, like we talk about students who are deaf, perhaps are colorblind or have some physical mobility issues. Are there any unique, do you have any stories that you encounter some unique requests that at first might surprise you or is somewhere unexpected? And if that happened, how did you resolve that seemingly new and unique request?
I'll jump in. I had a student who had multiple disabilities. So there were multiple things that I needed to do as a faculty member in order to accommodate that student. So I worked very closely with the Student Disability Services counselor that the student was assigned to in terms of how best to accommodate that. And I think that's something to remember is that so many disabilities, well, disability is very unique to that individual. And that individual might have multiple disabilities. We know disabilities relapse, remit, and maybe there's one, they might have something that progresses. So it's not going to stay consistent. And so that is something to just keep in your mind that if you have had, sometimes I hear professors say, oh, well, I had a student with ADHD before. And so they want to treat every student that has ADHD the same way. And that is not the case. And that's why you have an accommodations office on campus that goes through each case and creates individual recommendations and accommodations for that specific individual.
And if you employ some of these proactive steps in designing your course, you're not going to eliminate the need for accommodations, but you're going to let that office focus on more of those unique things that students will have, particularly if they have multiple disabilities and so forth, rather than the routine things like accessible documents and accessible technology and videos and all that sort of thing. That's what you're doing. You're reducing the need for accommodations and allowing that office to use the deep expertise they have to make the course accessible to them.
Also, just to chime in, I think one thing that I often like to do very early on in the semester in all courses, but is to send just a really brief getting to know you survey out to students. And that has a number of different questions, you know, thinking about who our students are, what their interests are, et cetera, but then including some language in questions there on, you know, accommodations or, you know, anything that we can do to make, you know, the learning experience better for, you know, for a particular student. And I think that's one way to start that conversation very early on in the term. Should a student, you know, be requesting an accommodation, you know, they could, you know, put something there, then you reach back out to them or start kind of a conversation in office hours, for example. And some of that can kind of be a welcoming way to start conversations around what students may need.
That's a great idea. I do something similar, but not the same thing. But I have, you know, you usually have at most institutions, there's an accommodation standard statement that you include in your syllabus. And one thing I don't like about that is if that's the first time you mention disability or accommodations, it's like, oh, you have accommodation, go there. Doesn't have anything to do with me. And I know that's not the intent, but that's kind of how it reads. And so I have two paragraphs. I have my statement for access to the course. And I say I apply universal design, and I even linked to that, by the way, what I'm talking about, and try to make my course accessible to all students. If you have some ideas for improving the accessibility of this course, please let me know. I tell them, come to me for that. You know, and then the next sentence is, if you require disability-related accommodations, go to that office. And that's so important as well, because some students with disabilities they don't even know there's that office yet. And they came from high school and they haven't really done a lot of research on how things are done in higher ed, and may still be waiting for someone to contact them about accommodations like it was done in high school. And so it kind of reaches those students too that never really thought about how their disability could be accommodated and that they had to take steps to make that happen, but also students that may never have been diagnosed. but all of a sudden they're realizing that maybe they do have some special issues that they'd like to talk to somebody about as far as their own learning ability.
I think some of you touch on this a little bit as well, but here's a question from the registration. Someone asked during registration that how would you balance seemingly conflicting accessibility needs? For example, if someone is immunocompromised, then you wear a mask, but the same student has difficulty hearing you, then with the mask, they can't hear you so well. So in this kind of example where students have seemingly conflicting needs, how would you work to address those unique needs?
This is one situation and something like that I would definitely consult with the Disability Services Office before I said anything. I always talk to faculty when they're confused about something like that. It seems a little complex. Never say no. Don't say, no, we can't do that. Or feel like you have to be the one to be the architect of a unique issue like that. My personal example is running into, in some training we've done, running into situations where someone has an attention deficit disorder and another student is deaf. We really like to have the sign language interpreter be very close to the speaker. And so the person who's deaf can see both this PowerPoint and the speaker and the sign language interpreter. What we've done in those situations, they're very, it's a situation we know people pretty well, so they're comfortable talking about this, is drawing the two individuals involved and saying, now we'd like to have the sign language interpreter fairly close. Is there any way we can kind of make them maybe not quite so close? And for the student with attention deficit disorder, is there some way you could be positioned so that it would minimize the difficulty for you? And we have always come up with very positive and very good solutions. Now, you do have to be a little bit careful. I'm talking about a situation where people are invited to this training, we kind of know them. But you're first doing that the first day in class as a faculty member, you might be a little hesitant to do that. But again, then the Disability Services Office, that's a great example of getting them engaged.
Yeah, maybe I'll follow up on that. Sheryl, you mentioned this idea of universal design, right? So when you think about accessibility, everyone's needs is kind of unique. And after all, we want to make the class accessible for everyone, but everyone is different. So how would you balance, the idea of universal design, like this way of thinking is universal versus in reality, perhaps there's always some new needs or unique needs that you may have never encountered before. Like, how would you balance that too?
Well, we create a lot of checklists in our Center on Universal Design Education through the Do It Center. And where they all come from is we're looking at the literature first. What are recommendations for making your course more inclusive, particularly in the universal design area, but also looking at the literature on working with students on the autism spectrum or whatever. Now, everybody's not going to do this research, by the way. You have 3 people that are quite motivated, and we do a lot of that looking around. But anyway, you should look for resources that have already done that consultation. And so you come up with some ideas. Very quickly, you come up with some overlapping ideas. For instance, really having very complete, very specific, concrete, plain English instructions on your assignments. We have panels of students with just different types of disabilities, and regardless of the mix we have, all these different types of disabilities that talk to faculty about design of their courses, so I get to listen to all these. And that's one of the things that first comes up. And you might look at that student and think, well, my gosh, they must need all sorts of things. But they just want you to write clearly. So that we can all improve on that. And how I do it in my class is I try to do that from the beginning. But then whenever I have a student ask me a question about an assignment, I ask myself, first of all, I ask them, what's confusing about this or whatever, and I give them the answer and so forth. But then after that, I reflect. Could I describe this a little bit differently? And so that it would be, this student wouldn't have had that question. Sometimes the answer is, well, it was kind of a unique question. No, I don't want to complicate the thing, the assignment that way. But more often it's, yeah, I could have said this over here a little bit more concretely or given an example or something like that. So that's a real simple thing. And so if you really adopt universal design, the multiple ways of learning and so forth, you're not really going to interfere with any of those conflicting things. I think the danger is that, and this came up a little earlier, is listening to one student and generalizing. Well, blind students all need this, and so therefore, I know I gave a presentation at a conference where they didn't want any visuals, no PowerPoints, no visuals. And I asked why about that. Well, because blind students can't see them, or blind participants. Well, yeah, that's not a big shock to them. But what do I do as a presenter? Well, I make sure I describe whatever content is in my, or whatever visual things I'm working with and showing to the rest of the audience. I just describe those, and then they will have access to it. And so those extreme things will come up. But I think if you really, like look reflectively at it, you should not be implementing procedures that erect barriers to some people unnecessarily, or just decide not to do something at all unnecessarily.
I think just to add to Cheryl's point there, that some of these, things may seem like very complex solutions or complex scenarios that sometimes do just require a very simple fix. For example, if a student has a request for note-taking, for example, providing students with the slides prior to class, as opposed to, students in class, right? You can post the slides right before class starts, and then the student has that to follow along with, or, some simple things that, aren't necessarily, upending your entire instruction, but rather kind of small tips and tricks that, are available to all students, including our students.
Yeah.
But yeah, and kind of small changes can make, big differences for everyone here.
And I think sometimes faculty and others can get overwhelmed by what they perceive as the complication of a person's disability. They might see someone in a wheelchair. It's clear that they don't have, that they can't use their hands. They're using special technology. Maybe they have a speech impairment. It looks very complicated, and they think they have to know a lot about that. But on the IT side of the house, a student that's using all sorts of different technology because of a physical disability, the technology is at the stage now with assistive technology that you can pretty much guarantee that that student has access to anything that we can do on the keyboard, period. And so you don't need to know exactly how, but they do. And so the arrow keys and the return key and the delete key, they can do that stuff. But the technology is not at the stage where people with physical disabilities have full access of the mouse. You can't guarantee that. So what does that mean to an IT person that's putting up an instructional website, for example? Well, if you have a pull down menu where people typically use the mouse, just make sure they can do it with the arrow keys and other stuff on the keyboard. You don't need to know what assistive technology they're using. You just have to know, don't rely on the mouse. And that is also true for blind students. They can manipulate a mouse, but it's not very effective if they can't see what it's doing on the screen. And so they also need to have technology that does not rely on the mouse. And so you're actually reaching a lot of very, very distinct people with disabilities and using a lot of different technology just by learning some simple basic things. And for instructors, that's about all you need to know. If you're going to become an IT specialist, then there's a lot more to learn.
Here's a question for everyone. It's also a question people submitted during registration. So as you incorporate accessibility, all these different wonderful ways to make your class more accessible for every student, how would you avoid perhaps single out one or two students that actually require the accommodation you're providing? We don't want to feel like all the attention is drawn to just the one or two special students. So how would you while making sure your class is accessible, but also ensuring that the students don't feel like singled out or they're different?
I think that's one of the beauties of universal design, in the sense that, so for instance, if you have videos with captions, that doesn't mean you have somebody that's deaf or hard of hearing in your class. It means that if I live in an apartment and I can't, turn the TV on really loud, I can use the captions. Or if I'm on the metro, I can read the captions as opposed to listen to it. I might have English as an additional language, and I might need to see, or some very, STEM specific terms where I want to see the spelling and the actual pronunciation of those terms. So it can help in many ways. And if you frame it like that, that can be very helpful for your students. And I mean, you never want to call anyone out with an accommodation request. It is actually illegal to do that within your class setting. But really thinking about how can these things, how can in this learning environment from a social justice model and a social model of disability, how can we help remove any kind of barrier to access and improve the learning experience for all students, not just the students that have an accommodation?
Even in a special assignment, like I mentioned, the one about I have students go out and look for an image of something, a physical environment. I don't say, oh, and if you're blind, then you can do this alternative. No, I just say as an alternative. So I'm giving them two options. So I'm giving them multiple ways to do things, but I'm also making the assignment then accessible to pretty much everyone. There might be someone that needs needs an accommodation to that, but I haven't run into one yet. And also by doing it this way, I have a number of students who I do not think are blind. My class is fully accessible to people who are blind, so they may not disclose if they know that, but I'm almost sure that it's not every student that every student that takes that second alternative is blind. It's probably somebody that thought, oh, hey, I saw this the other day and I was pretty excited about this and how it applies in this class. And so you make it's available to everyone. And so it's not singling anybody out.
Yeah, and we actually also get another question during registration who asked, as you incorporate all these different universal design approaches, how do you make sure that the class content is still challenging to some extent for those who have experience? Sometimes we're trying to make things accessible. People might take it as like making it easier to understand, easier to comprehend. But how do you distinguish the difference between making sure the content is accessible while there's still some challenges in the content itself? Does that make sense?
Well, proactive design should never lower your standards in your class. And so if you feel like it's lowering your standards, a faculty member can only address that, but they need to really reflect on it seriously, not just on the surface. But things like using plain English, you're not going to, you have to look at the words that you're using. And sometimes in our own fields, actually all the time, we're using jargon. We need to just kind of step back a minute and say, well, all the students understand this jargon. Maybe it's a cultural thing. When my class, I like to use the expression, I realized, because I have reflected on low-hanging fruit. I'm always talking about low-hanging fruit. I never noticed it until I started reflecting on it. And then I thought, I wonder people, if they live in a different country or some other situation, I wonder if they even know what that expression means. When you think about low-hanging fruit on a tree, it sounds a little, in Washington here, it'd be apple picking, but and so anyway, so I just when I first use it, and I said, by the way, when I use the expression low-hanging fruit, I mean, it's very easy to describe. I don't think anybody would say I'm lowering the standards of my class because I'm describing that. And another one that faculty almost often do in presenters is not spelling out acronyms, because we think, oh, everybody knows this. PDF, everybody knows what PDF is or whatever. Those are some of the things in technology that I run into. And reflecting and saying, maybe I should spell this out the first time that I'm using it. And by reflecting on these two things, by the way, you really realize some of the practices we have as faculty members that use maybe English that's hard for people to understand, but also we don't spell out our acronyms. And it kind of gets back to this universal design idea that you're not designing for the average person. I think the average person in all my classes know what low-hanging fruit means. Absolutely, I think. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that. But I'm not thinking about that. What's the diversity of the students that might be in my class and who might not understand? How much work does it really take to just tell them what I mean?
And I think to go back to our earlier point, thinking about assessment as well, and how we evaluate our students, and if we could actually think about maybe, as I was saying, lower stakes assessments, but maybe actually incorporating more challenging, more realistic problem solving, for example, and some of those things, as opposed to a multiple choice exam as a way to evaluate students. And, really, as, speaking to a community of scientists, really kind of putting in some of the, authentic science practice into your course at the expense of removing some of the things that, exist because they've always exist, the midterm and the final exam, right? Is there a way we can, actually envision still keeping those what I mean by low stakes, lower percentages of points, but actually maybe some of those are more applicable, more challenging, and kind of more complex problem solving scenarios, for example, from an assessment standpoint.
Picking up about that in STEM, thinking specifically about STEM, one of the more common problems in accessibility is that the very complicated images and tables and stuff that are used in STEM. Take a look at some STEM textbooks, and all the images are very complicated, and they're very difficult to describe, let's say, to a student who's blind. But they also include a lot of content that's difficult for students to parse. Now, you might decide that is part of the learning. I'm trying to get them to understand these complicated images. Well, then you as an instructor should teach the steps you go through to understand that image. You shouldn't just assume that every student can do that. But you almost might, but I think you should also ask yourself, could I present that in a more an easy to understand way? And there are many resources on the internet that are about that, usually funded by the National Science Foundation. And often it ends up like breaking up your images into maybe kind of a first big image. This kind of shows the big picture. And then the next slide might be adding some content, the second layer essentially. And then the next one, the third layer. And you go through that. And it's much easier to gain that content. I don't think most science teachers would think that that's, reducing the quality of their class or the level of their class. It just gives this complicated image, makes it accessible to more people. Same with tables that have so many different levels. Could you sometimes just breaking it into two tables that have, so they don't have so many labels, can make it more accessible to someone who's blind, who can't, who has to rely on descriptions of that content, but a lot of other people as well. In fact, sometimes I really encourage people to think about students who are blind, not because you're going to have a lot of students who are blind in your class, but because if you make your class accessible to a student who's blind, it will make it accessible to a lot of other people as well.
I would also say to add to this conversation in terms of faculty, when a student makes a request to an accommodations for an accommodation, the accommodation needs to be reasonable as well as not fundamentally alter the course content. So if you are a faculty member and have concerns about an accommodation that you receive, a request, if you feel that it fundamentally alters the rigor of the course or the assignment, then that is a great time to engage your Office of Student Accessibility and have a conversation with them to express your concerns.
Excellent. That's a really excellent piece of advice. I'm glad that you added that. The Disability Services Office mainly communicates with the students on a lot of campuses. That's kind of the student comes to them for accommodations. And sometimes they'll recommend or they'll approve an accommodation. And sometimes faculty feel they don't have can't even discuss the matter. And I found disability services personnel being very open to talking to faculty and coming up with some kind of a compromise maybe. And so the student can, because sometimes a faculty member doesn't realize they're not recommending that accommodation to reduce the quality or the difficulty of your course. And so they did that unintentionally because maybe they didn't think of another way to do this, but you on the faculty side should be able to reflect on it too and might think of a way to keep everybody happy and make your course accessible to that student.
Great.
That's a really good point, Sheryl. Sorry, I just wanted to chime in.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Before we move to the live Q&A, I just want to ask one last question to all the panelists. So how would you envision the future of teaching when it comes to accessibility? Like, what is a better future looks like for you? Or what do you think are like some of the challenges we're facing right now? And like, how can we get there?
Yeah, the reason I didn't immediately respond is, I'm not super optimistic about some of the directions we're going. We just seem to be adding more and more people to our Disability Services Office. I'm not trying for accommodations. I'm not trying to put those people out of business, but I would like to see us kind of pivot. We have to provide accommodations by law, so I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but somehow pivot in those offices where more and more people in there are working proactively. We have situations where people in that office remediate all the PDFs and other documents in a class and provide them to a student who needs them remediated, but that professor does not adopt using those accessible versions the next time they teach it. And I talk to faculty quite a bit, and some will say, oh, hey, oh, Krista over there, disability service office, she's great. So I don't have accessible document. Oh, she'll take care of it. She takes care of this stuff, and I find that rather offensive, frankly. But how to pivot, and so that we get more effort in the universal design category, and less, not necessarily less right away, but in ultimately reducing the need for accommodations. When I talk to faculty about this sort of thing, often it's, they feel like all the pressure's on them. I've got to learn how to make my documents accessible. You tell me to do these captions, whatever. Well, there are some things to be thinking about. I tell faculty when I'm talking to them in a particular department, well, what resources would you need to be able to do some of this? And often when we come up with, frankly, there's some very concrete things. I have one, the School of Social Work. They will do all document remediation for their faculty, proactively, reactively, or what. And so they help them make them accessible, blah, 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 blah. Okay, we have the business school that's adopted the practice of doing all the captioning on videos that faculty have in their online classes. So they're taking something off the table. And as I talk to faculty and departments, it's like, well, isn't that what we do when people have certain things that they have in common in a department or a school, and they need help with that? We give them central services, and often it lands in the lap of the IT people. So many departments, especially in large schools and colleges, have their own IT accessibility, or not necessarily accessibility people, but their IT support. They can work with a group like mine that's centrally funded to learn how to make documents accessible and caption videos and do some other things as well. And then maybe they could, besides training their faculty, but they actually can do some of this stuff.
All right, maybe we can move to the live Q&A. We actually got quite a few questions so far. The first question is for Sheryl. Someone is asking, the alt text is something that Genomics Education Partnership has been struggling with, particularly for describing images from a genome browser and explaining how to annotate a gene, for example. The technology itself isn't really accessible. So how do you describe something that is not designed for students for students with different needs, to allow them to perhaps access those technology like a genome browser, or how to annotate a gene?
How to annotate something that it can be very difficult, particularly in STEM. And there are some proven practices in doing description. The simplest idea, the way to think about it is, what if you do have a student that you're talking to by phone, and they're having, they're not able to access your visuals, your PowerPoints or whatever, but you're trying to describe some concept. What would you tell them? I think most people would say something because they know their topic. What is presented? What is the point of that image? This isn't going to solve all your problems, by the way, but many it will. Why are you showing that image to anybody? And another thing, I have faculty will say, well, gee, I've got this simulation that I've got to use in my chemistry class, and it's really great, and it's not accessible to students with a number of different types of disabilities. And I ask them this, well, how long has that simulation been around? Oh, it's a new one. It's been around for 2 years. Did you teach that concept before? Well, of course. I say, well, how about doing that? But it's not as cool as a simulation. Well, if you can't access a simulation, it's pretty darn cool. So just kind of think about that. And difficult things besides even images, but things like, well, I go on field trips and they're not accessible, wheelchair accessible. Well, what could you do as an alternative? Maybe having somebody have a live video of what's going on in the field trip, and that person who can't actually go out there could actually be maybe taking some notes, interviewing people about what they're discovering and so forth. I don't know, but really thinking creatively, I think, is the bottom line to all that.
I think one thing related to this question and the previous question is really thinking about 21st century education and technology, right? And it's this conundrum in some ways where it's introducing additional barriers, but it's alleviating others, right? Yeah. And I think we really just want to think as educators, practitioners, developers, et cetera. How can we envision a system that is using the technology in a sense to alleviate as many of these accessibility barriers as possible instead of introducing new ones. So actually, just to Sheryl's point, one thing out of Arizona State University, where I previously was, they do a virtual field trip, and it goes up. It's a geology course that goes up to the Grand Canyon, and the instructor developed it, but it's essentially like virtual reality, and you get to see so many new things that you wouldn't even be able to see had you gone on a physical field trip to the Grand Canyon, right? And so introducing, that technology is, potentially, alleviating accessibility concerns, but, inherently though, it's going to introduce new ones, right? And I think we just want to think really critically about that moving forward. What are we introducing and what are we alleviating with all the technology at our fingertips, if you will?
And that's a great example, because you think, well, who might not be able to access that simulation? Well, a blind student probably. Well, what should you do about that? Well, if it's a one-time thing you're doing in your class, it might just require a human being to describe it. The visuals. Ideally, you'd have the whole thing described and so forth, and maybe you can do that, particularly if you're going to use it a lot, or maybe by other schools and stuff. But the intervention of a human being in some of these accommodations is still important.
Yeah, and here I'm combining two questions from a live audience. Someone's asking that, so this person is on job market and is wondering how to tailor their presentation so that it's most accessible to the audience when there's not really no information about who will be in the audience. And related to that, like, what is some of your favorite and reliable resource for universal design? I guess we'll talk about universal design and accommodations a lot. What are some of the good resources that people can look up to, or what is your go-to website or stuff like that?
Well, Ingrid gave a plug to our website. We have a lot of resources. We have a lot of grants, and we always have products we share. And that's the Do It website. You can just Google it, DO-, don't forget the dash, IT, because it's for disabilities, opportunities, internetworking, and technology. And I also like to put in a plug for IT accessibility teams like my own, is we work day and night to make mainstream technology accessible. It's not just about the technology student with a disability might use. And we're using Zoom today. And we years ago were looking for a conferencing software package that we would standardize on our campus and later be adopted for the whole state of Washington. And so my group was represented on the team, and they voted against Zoom because of the ones they were looking at, it was the least accessible. And so we were outnumbered. The rest of the group said, oh yeah, we've got to have Zoom. We really like the features and the feel of it and so forth. And then we went into our second plan B, and plan B was we get into the contract itself that Zoom designers will agree to work with my team to make that product increasingly more accessible over time. Zoom is now recognized as the most accessible conferencing software in the world, actually. It's because of teams like mine and other large post-secondary institutions primarily that have the resources where we invest in that. Same with Canvas and Blackboard, and a lot of these mainstream products we make accessible. But what it also means is you find the newest little toolkit out there, or some technology tool that some graduate student just put up, it's probably not going to be very accessible. So maybe don't use that.
I would say also thinking about peers and what's out there in the literature already. There's a lot of literature out there in discipline-specific fields that can be very helpful. You might not be able to adopt it wholesale, but you can certainly customize it to your own needs and finances and whatever other criteria you're thinking about when you're implementing these things. And certainly there are at conferences is a great place to have these kind of conversations. And I'd encourage you, all of you, as you get out there, to different STEM conferences or pedagogical conferences to propose a panel on something like this and see, how you can start a conversation around this, because I do think that this topic will be coming to the forefront even more. We saw that with COVID. Certainly digital accessibility came to the forefront. So there are a lot more people that are looking towards this under the DEI umbrella, as Logan said at the beginning, which is exciting. But it's a lot of information sharing. So there's a lot of information out there. No need to reinvent the wheel from the beginning on everything. Leverage the resources that you do have available to you.
Great. The next question is, do you have any suggestions for faculty who themselves are navigating teaching with their own disabilities? Some faculty themselves might have, for example, hearing impairment or other forms of disabilities.
I'm really glad you asked that. We get a lot of projects at the Do It Center. One of our latest projects is called Access Advance. And the purpose of this particular project is to increase the success, the accessibility and success of faculty members with disabilities in STEM. And so we have engaged a community of faculty members in STEM that have disabilities and others, and have created a document on how to make your program, your STEM department, your STEM institution, whatever, more inclusive of faculty members with disabilities, in consultation with a lot of faculty members with disabilities. And so we have a lot of resources in that regard. And the title of it, the project, is Access STEM. All one word. And so if you Google that, I don't think there are a lot of other Google sites that you're going to run into by that name.
And I will just add, as someone with a physical disability who went through a graduate PhD program, these are some of the challenges that I faced firsthand, and work that I think continually want to do and kind of be a part of. So I'm glad Sheryl mentioned that. Yeah, access as a resource for that, but really things to think about. And I will say, just firsthand from my experience as a graduate student, it's often challenging as someone with a disability in terms of your status within a university. And it's, as a graduate student who might be taking courses, do I go to the Disability Resource Center and access those resources? But if I'm a graduate student teaching or doing research, that some of those become HR and kind of the umbrella of where your workplace accommodations might come. So I think I think there's a lot of work that kind of needs to be done, but it's a really important population, right? Especially as we want to think about increasing representation and diversity and inclusion of individuals with disabilities. Thinking about at the faculty and graduate student level is just as important as the undergraduate level in many ways. So yeah, so I think there's hopefully ongoing conversations around faculty members and professors with disabilities.
All right, we have just a couple minutes left. Here are two related questions. Someone is asking, how can we engage in a dialogue conversation about accessibility and visibility of people with disabilities, especially when there are pushback? Like if there are people who don't necessarily agree or want to do this kind of stuff, how would you engage them in this sort of dialogue? I guess it's kind of unfortunate, but it does happen sometimes.
Yeah, I think resistance is a real thing. It's realistic to expect that from whether it's from faculty or peers or whomever you're working with, even just society in general. There are reasons why, and it's a very individual reason. Oftentimes it's based on positionality and bias that you have experienced or non-experienced with people with disabilities as well. So that can also influence how you respond. I say one thing that would be effective, well, two things actually. One is phases. So don't try to load up everything, even if you're doing just digital accessibility. Do it in phases. So don't say you got to make your whole course accessible like tomorrow. That's very unrealistic and can be very daunting because it is a process. And I would also say specifically what I found when working with faculty here at USC is really making the case of why we're doing this. So discussing academic ableism, putting it into a societal context, putting it into the context of universal design. So we get a lot of like, why should I do this? Like you're telling me to do this. This is extra work for me. And why? So giving them that reason why and having that discussion can be very helpful in thinking about it and them processing.
Yeah, and for some audiences, at the right time with the right facilitator, a panel of students with different types of disabilities, particularly students that are being successful in your institution, to share things that work for them and so forth. A lot of faculty members, and also the barriers that they face. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the things they bring up are just simply simple. When we have a live panel, we'll actually pay $50 a piece. I think I'm going to raise that now with the inflation, but I'll pay students through the Do It Center $50 a piece. So they'll participate on these panels that we invite them to be in any class on campus, talk about whatever topic that faculty member wants to talk about. And by the way, we'll provide the panel and they can ask the questions. No, they want us to be the facilitator in almost all cases. They just a little nervous about it. Well, fine, we provide the facilitation as well. They help us figure out what are the best questions and so forth. But what these students say are just really simple things. When you ask a question, for instance, tell about one challenge you had with in a particular class with faculty member, and tell us one thing that was really helpful to you. The things that they say, one student often, if she gets asked the question, she's on these panels a lot, says, I just wish faculty members wouldn't point out my disability to the whole class and assume that I understand something or whatever sentence that it's part of. Now, this is a student who's very confident and is not embarrassed about her disability at all, but being singled out for that quality when she's also brilliant and probably the best student in the class and has all sorts of these different interests, but for disability to be the thing that they point to, particularly that's a personal piece of information, but also some of the things that people ask for, like I said in the instructions. When I'm going to a lab, sometimes the instructions, the faculty member just speaks them, where it would be really helpful if they were up on the internet and I could look back and see exactly what they were. And it was step by step. How many times do faculty members in STEM do that? Well, now go to the lab now, and what I want you to do there is, and it seems like a pretty simple thing. Well, the students are thinking about other things, so probably a lot of students would have difficulty with that, but the having panels, I think, is a real plus.
All right, that brings us to the end of today's workshop. Unfortunately, we cannot get to the remaining questions, but please feel free to reach out to the panelists afterwards. Thank you all participants for joining us today and for asking questions. We're extremely grateful for all three panelists to taking their time to share their expertise and insights with us. You can check out our next Accessibility in STEM workshop by visiting our website, which can be accessed through the QR code here. Thank you all. Have a great day.